I wanted to thank the IM 2017 organizers for having me here. I will say this very honestly, this is perhaps one of the meetings this year and the one I attended earlier in Jodhpur, which have been perhaps two of the best meetings I've ever attended in these many years, simply because, of course, we get to meet so many people, and it's always very inspirational because I get inspired by your work, your dreams, your ambitions. So basically what I will talk about is my very, very limited journey that I have made over the last 23 years. In fact, yesterday marked the 23rd anniversary of my work with primates. And it's a very personal journey. And in the course of this journey, I think I've learned more about myself than about what I set out to study. And this sums it up very well. So Malcolm de Chazal is a very unknown French humorist. He was born and died on the island of Mauritius, and this is what he had to say. He said, monkeys are superior to men in this: when a monkey looks into the mirror, he sees a monkey, right? And that's where I started off as well. I clearly didn't see myself when I started this journey, but what I would hopefully tell you is that in course of these meanderings that I have made, there's been some knowledge that I've acquired, and which I think has been a blessing. All that I will tell you is not meant to be a prescription. It's not meant to make you afraid. It's not meant to do anything else except to perhaps share with you some of the adventures I've had. Okay, so I've had actually, geographically speaking, a very, very short journey over these last years. I did my PhD in molecular biology, studying yeast biochemistry at the TIFR in Bombay, and then I moved from Bombay. Till my master's, I was in Calcutta, 25 years, 5 years in Bombay, TIFR, doing my PhD in molecular biology, and then I moved to the ISC campus, and over the next 26 years, I've only moved northwards through the ISC campus. I was first in the Center for Ecological Sciences, next at NCBS. Of course, this is the new NCBS building. At that time, it was in the ISC campus, and finally, my first and hopefully my last job at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. Now, when I did my undergraduate in botany with a specialization in cytogenetics, I was very keen to study dolphins. And I wormed my way into Andhra University in Voltaire, where I joined the marine biology course. But the Calcutta University published their BSc results 1 year late, and therefore Andhra University threw me out. I went back to Calcutta University and then did a summer program in TIFR and fell in love with that place. And that's what got me into molecular biology. But this was also the age when I wanted to clone a gene. I didn't care for what. Whatever the gene was, I wanted to clone it. So it was in those heady days when molecular biology was coming in, and we all forgot that molecular biology is a set of techniques, not an end in itself. And therefore I moved, and I must spend some time telling you about my PhD advisor, Professor Pabitra Kumar, who's a remarkable man and an unsung hero in a manner of speaking. He was a pioneer in yeast biochemical genetics, and along with Dan Frankel of Harvard, I think pioneered this field. He, of course, had an inordinate love for yeast and, of course, for beer. In fact, when I first met him, he asked me, I hear you want to work with me? I said, yes. And he said, do you drink beer? And I didn't know whether to say yes or no. And so I said, yes or no? Yes. Yes? Yes. You can join me. So that's how I got into Professor Moitra's lab, and I think speaks volumes about what a mentor he could have been. He, of course, had certain rules that he said, these are not my rules. These are what Sir Hans Krebs had suggested. You have to be into the lab by 9 o'clock. You have to finish whatever you planned for the day, and you have to be up to date with the current literature. But if I see you in the library, you're wasting your time. Right. So those were Hans Krebs' rules. But there were some Maitra principles, what I call the Maitra principles, and they were remarkable. And I would like to share them with you because I think this is a problem that plagues mentor or PhD advisor-student relationships even today. There are some quotes that I have. My career does not depend on your productivity. After all, the PhD is your problem. And he made sure he had more number of single author papers while I was doing my PhD every year than I had. And so there was no pressure on me about his promotion, about his tenure, and I think that was remarkable. He used to work at the bench from 9 in the morning till 6 in the evening, which meant that I couldn't bunk the lab as much as I wanted to. But it also meant that whenever the fluorimeter didn't work, he was there to help me repair it. That was remarkable. Secondly, he said, you do not include me as an author if I have not contributed to that work at all, which I also thought was absolutely amazing. And at the end, when I told him, when I finished my PhD and I said I want to go and study monkeys, there was horror. TIFR molecular biology unit had never had a student who wanted to give up molecular biology and go study monkeys. And I remember Vijay being quite upset with me. And at which point, because Vijay was on my committee, at which point Professor Maitra turned to him and said, if he wants to study monkeys, there must be something in it. And I think that really helped me get into this field, so I pay homage to this remarkable man. Right, now that's my first paper, a search for mutations that affect the non-oxidative pentose phosphate pathway in Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And the reason I want to mention this is because this paper represents roughly 70% of my PhD, and it was all negative results. Right? But I insisted on publishing it because I felt that maybe a large number of students would benefit from knowing what they shouldn't be doing if they wanted to look for mutations in the pentose phosphate pathway. And of course, there is this famous story, right, of these two prisoners where one is digging in, wants to escape, and the other refuses to join him. And then he digs and he digs and he digs and he comes out and he gets caught, gets pushed back into the cell. And this other guy is saying, I knew you'd be caught. So he said, then why didn't you tell me? He said, who publishes negative results? So I think that's an important story. And so lesson number one that I learned, please publish your negative results. Second, I decided to move out after my PhD. Now, to animal ecology and behavior and cognitive science. And the first question is, why did I decide to move in a direction that was really opposite to what most people were doing at that time? And there were three reasons. Reason number one, I didn't want to go abroad for a postdoc. It was a very silly, stupid rationale that I had. I just wanted to be here, as simple as that. My family, my friends, and I wanted to do research in India. So I decided, therefore, to work in a field that did not involve molecular biology or laboratory techniques that depended on sophisticated instrumentation. I knew that I would never be able to compete with the Western countries because we would still be dependent on their technology. And if I were in a university setup, because I had no idea where I would get a job, I don't think I would have managed to really be productive. I was also very interested in fundamental research. I didn't want to work in applied areas. The second reason, also research in the wilderness. I wanted to look at organisms. I wanted to study organismic biology in the field. I did not want to work in the laboratory. The third reason is I felt that if I worked in an area where I could intellectually contribute, that might be a better, it might have better prospects for my academic future. And so that was that. And of course, it's not easy being an Indian postdoc in the early 1990s. And my close friend Imran is here. And at that time, in 1991 to 1993, when I was a postdoc in the Indian Institute of Science, there were only two other postdocs in the biological sciences. One was Imran, who had just returned after his PhD. And the third was Pradeep Burma, Freddie, who now heads genetics in Delhi University South Campus. And the three of us would sit and eat bread and omelette at 12 in the night in the gymkhana, mourning our loss. And that quote that comes was from the then chairperson of the biochemistry department in ISC. I had given a talk there on my PhD work. And then after I finished the talk and I was leaving, I overheard this gentleman tell another faculty, there must be something seriously wrong with him. He hasn't gone abroad. So that's really the travails that you had to deal with. And of course, there was problem at home as well. So I had a very angry father who thought I was going to go abroad and do a postdoc in the University of Chicago or wherever. And he very angrily said, so are you going to just watch a monkey's tail and how many times he wags it? And I was trying to convince him that, look, no knowledge is ever wasted. I've done my PhD in molecular biology and I've benefited from it, and I'm sure it will come in handy another day. And it has. I mean, I have done now in collaboration with a close friend, Umar Ramarkrishnan of NCBS, we've done quite a bit of genetics, and I've returned back in a manner of speaking. So I think we should never be afraid of what we have experienced, because it all comes back to us at some point of time. And then, of course, why did I never leave? You know why I never left. And that's equivalent to why you should return. And I've been talking to some of you about this. I think the only reason you should return, or you may want to return, is for just that one reason. You want to be here. It's not about grants. It's not about publications. It's not about students. It's not about institutions. You want to work here, whatever be the conditions. And if that grabs you, then you'll come back. And then there's this line from Ulysses by Tennyson, which I really like. So that was how I sort of got into this new field. And let me now just spend a bit of time when I wanted to actually work on mines, which was my primary interest. But then I realized that when I started working on mines, you get involved at different levels of organization. Believe me, there are connections between them that are extremely important. And I will give you an example of how that works. But let me start off just giving you some glimpses of the kind of work we have done, not in any detail. If you don't understand any of it, I can explain it to you later. Don't worry about the details. But one of the very important problems that we are facing is that of the loss of biodiversity in our country. And I realized that we have some extremely rich primate assemblages in many parts of our country. So the evergreen forests of the Brahmaputra Valley in northeast India parallels Brazil in terms of its primate biomass. There are forest patches which are about 8 to 10 square kilometers with 6 species of primates. Just incredible. And this is just the distribution of the various primates. Don't worry about it. But it's tragic how they're disappearing. And this is a long-term project that we had started and which lasted for 10 years, during the course of which, in one of these fragments, we saw 3 species of primates go extinct even while we were studying them. But there was hope. There were also other fragments where the population stabilized over time. And so this project actually tried to look at what were the factors that promoted diversity in the first place. How did they coexist in spite of the degradation of their habitat? Is there niche specialization? Do they have ecological niches which allow them to coexist? What is the nature of the interactions that they have with each other? And from all of this, can we learn how to save these last primate populations? I started off by saying I didn't want to do applied research. I wanted to do fundamental research. But then you realize at some point of time that the distinction between them blur. And you go and you get dragged in from one to the other. And it's nice to go along because I think it's important that we do. Okay, so now I will tell you one story which has elements of how, when you start looking at a species, you start looking at their populations, and within populations, the societies they live in, and of course, the individuals. And this is the story of the bonnet macaque. Now, this is the species that I've been studying now for 23 years. It's found only in southern India. It is extremely widely distributed in a variety of habitats, and in fact, there is, I think, no South Indian town or city that does not have populations of this species. But there's a remarkable amount of complexity in their lives. They're usually in multi-male, multi-female troops that vary greatly in size and complexity. But what we have now documented, and I will tell you a bit about it, we've documented a very recent evolution of a completely different kind of social organization in one population. And again, tragically, to a certain extent, this is driven by human forces. There are other interesting features about it, and I don't have time to spend on this, but if you look at a troop of bonnet macaques, there's a very clear dominance hierarchy amongst males, and there's a very clear hierarchy amongst females. But what is fascinating is that for the males, the hierarchy is entirely driven by biology. It depends on how strong the males are, how good their alliances are, and what kind of manipulative behaviors they can show. In the case of the females, however, it's fascinating that the dominance hierarchy is set up culturally. So if you're a daughter of a dominant mother, you are dominant. It doesn't matter whether you're blind or lame. Biology does not matter. Yet, by becoming dominant, there are certain other processes that begin which are biological, and therefore I think this is a wonderful example of how we have gene-culture coevolution even in a non-human species. And these are, again, as I said, glimpses that I wanted to give you about how, using very simple observational techniques, you discover fairly complex phenomena that I think need to be understood more. Right? Now, this is a fairly long-term study that we are doing. This is a 25-year project on this population of this species in a place called the Bandipur National Park, again in southern India, where we are looking at the demography, behavioral ecology, and the life history strategies of currently about 1,600 individuals, all of whom we know by face. Right? Now, they don't coexist because there's a turnover, many of them have left, many of them have died, but at any point of time there are about 350 to 400 individuals, but over the last 17 years there are 1,600 individuals that we know. And what I wanted to point out here is that just as these are 5 males from 5 troops, and as you can see they're distinctive in their hairstyles, but they are also extremely distinctive in their behaviors, in their life history strategies. And I think that's really the goal of this study, is to really document individual variation, which as a biologist, as a zoologist, I've never been trained to do. I've always been asked to look for means, averages, the rules, the laws. But I think what is fascinating about biology, and I think it goes from cells to societies, is the variation. And again, I will not belabor this point, but as Stephen Jay Gould very rightly said, biology is the science of the diversity, of the variance, not of the means. And I think it's extremely important for all of us to remember, this has been one of my greatest lessons, that you ignore diversity, you ignore the variance at your own peril. Right. Now, this is the model I wanted to briefly talk about. So how did this new form of social organization of unimale, multi-female group start? And it comes from 2 factors. The dry season, the food is very patchy, and now there is this tremendous tourist influx into the sanctuary, all of whom throw out food, which is against the government rules, but they still throw out food because of salvation, because of religious reasons. But what happens is that this food, which is rich and clumped, leads to very severe competition amongst females. And why do I talk of females? Because this species is, the females are philopatric, which means they live in the area where they are born all their lives. Males come and they go, right? So it's important to try and understand what happens to the females in these groups. Now, this competition that exists leads to a new phenomenon that we have started documenting, which is fission, where groups split, or where individual females leave groups and go and join other groups. And this results in small groups of females who can then be monopolized by a single male, and this leads to a unimale social organization. So even as we speak, evolution is occurring, right? Whether these also spell genetic changes over generations is something that we have to yet discover, but the point is that phenotypically we are seeing profound changes in social organization and concomitantly with the behavior of individuals who belong to these organizations. And that was what brought us to this idea of how flexible this macaque species is in terms of their behavioral adaptation, in terms of their social lability. And I've just sort of put in a flow chart. So what we've been saying is that the unpredictability in food abundance and distribution has led to group fission and female emigration, leading to smaller group sizes. And this has 2 effects. So first, there is flexibility in female social strategies dependent on their dominance ranks, but this group fission and female emigration also has an effect where there's a flexibility now in male behavioral strategies and their emigration strategies. There is also, we've documented skewing of sex ratio of offspring by males or females in these unimale organizations, and I don't have time to talk about it. And these flexibility in these male strategies has in turn seems to have selected for female emigration strategies, because what seems to be happening in addition to the original group fission that I was talking about is that females who find themselves in unimale groups tend to leave and join multi-male groups because there's a lack of mate choice. they're forced to mate with that single aggressive male in the group. So again, over a period of just 15, 20 years, there are profound changes being brought in, and what we need to now look at is again go back to the individual. We have just begun some studies looking at personality in the wild, which is a fairly difficult exercise, but we are trying it. But overall, I wanted to again bring home this message of individuality. How do you deal with your data which has 1,600 individuals doing 1,600 strategies? It's a challenge even in terms of logistics, in terms of analysis, but I think it's a challenge we need to take up because, again, this is something we have to bring in to the mainstream biological thinking. Right, now these changes that we see in these bonnet macaques seem to have very major implications for their long-term survival. And therefore, the simple act that many of us Indians sitting in this room are very familiar with, feeding a monkey, can have very profound effects at the level of the society, at the level of the individual. I didn't have time to talk about the data really, but while these profound changes are coming about, macaques seem to show remarkable behavioral flexibility, take on a wide variety of strategies, all of which allows them to adapt to these very, very difficult changing conditions. So the other lesson that came through is that we sometimes underestimate how strong many of these populations are, which have been naturally selected over millions of years to adapt to different kinds of environments. And we are really seeing that. But where are these bonnet macaques going? And what we've now found is that over a period of 11 years, 64% of our unimale troops have disappeared. But the 10 multimale troops that we have continue today. So we think, therefore, that these changes are not good for their long-term survival. There are two sets of processes, a stochastic process and another biological, which I can discuss later, which are responsible for these differential survival of these forms of organization. And we now need, which nobody believes, but we now need management strategies, we need conservation strategies for even some of our most common species, which are in the danger of disappearing, even without us recognizing that they are going. Right. The last aspect of my work that I wanted to talk about is really to give you a glimpse of how we study the cognitive processes in wild animals. I've never wanted to study them in captivity, and this was a bit of a challenge, but I will give you an idea of how we do this. Now, why do we study the primate mind in the first place? And I just wanted to point out a few reasons, and this is the reason that drove me. I really wanted to understand what it is to be a monkey. Now, clearly I will not, but I think there's no harm in trying. The second reason, of course, is evolutionary. How did our minds develop? How did our minds evolve? Third is, can we understand more fully how the primate brain works? And we know that there are a number of paradigms in primate behavior in the laboratory that are being subjected to neurobiological analyses, but there are so many paradigms out there in the wild which perhaps we have not even started to fathom. And I think it's very important for us to discover new paradigms that can then be brought into the laboratory and subjected perhaps to more detailed, more controlled studies, but we need to really understand what's happened out there. And finally, and very, very importantly, will our knowledge of the primate mind influence the way we relate to them, the way we exploit them, the way we treat them? And I think that's, again, another extremely important application of some of our work, because it does set a new sort of understanding of the relationship that we have with other non-human species. And I will just talk a bit about how we try to understand social knowledge in macaques. And what does that mean? It means that when macaques interact with each other in a society, what does an individual know about the other individuals that she is interacting with, and how does that influence her decision-making process? And clearly, when you want to understand the mind, you have to understand decision-making. And what we typically do in the wild is to try and understand when an individual is faced with a choice, a behavioral choice, what is the decision she makes, and what are the factors that influence that particular decision. That's basically the strategy we use. And I'll just give you an example of this. Now, there are 3 females, A, B, C, and they can be any 3 females in the group as long as the hierarchical position is A, and then B, and then C. And it's linear and it's transitive. So if A is dominant to B and B is dominant to C, then A is dominant to C. Now, it can happen that B and C are sitting together, grooming each other, and they suddenly see A dominant female, approach them. Now, what seemed to happen is that in 85% of the cases, C leaves even before A reaches them, right? And it seems, therefore, and that seems to be the rule, that the female C tends to avoid 2 dominant females, A and B, from approaching, right? Because she can't tolerate 2 dominant females. How does she know they're dominant? Because they've beaten her up several times. So she decides to go. But in 15% of the cases, it was B who left. She's dominant to C, but she decided to leave. And the simple question I asked is, why does this happen? Now, again, a very, very important lesson that I learned is that, again, as I said, never neglect the exceptions. The exceptions are what gives you the most fascinating insights. And this is what happened. We had a very simple rule for 85% of the cases, but in the 15% of the cases we discovered, and I'm going to keep this very short, is here is a graph where on the y-axis you have the proportion of times B leaves. And what you see on the x-axis, what you see on the x-axis is what I call the social attractiveness. I can define this later for you. How popular is C as an animal, as a female in that group. And what it turned out is that when C became more and more socially attractive, B decided to leave, right? And so that was interesting. It clearly meant that B was taking cognizance of how socially attractive C is when she was taking a decision to go. And so we decided to model this. There was another small piece of evidence that came up, that if A actually did reach B and C, she could do either of 2 things. She could either allogroom one of them, and she always allogroomed B, or she could show aggression, and she showed it towards C, which clearly meant that she was able to distinguish who was dominant of the 2 females who were sitting there, right? So these 2 females, for her to know who's dominant amongst the 2 of them, clearly requires observation of the interactions of others and abstraction of that information. And so what we did was, and again, I will keep this short, we did a logistic regression analysis to try and understand what are the factors that determine or increase the probability that B would leave. And it turns out that there were 3 factors that were important. As B became more and more subordinate in the entire hierarchy, she was more likely to go. When the rank difference with A decreased, she was more likely to go. And when the rank difference increased, so C became more and more subordinate to her, she was very likely to go. So clearly, therefore, knowledge seemed to be egotistical in the sense that bonnet macaques appeared to know their own dominance ranks in the hierarchy. They seemed to know of the ranks of other females relative to them. So when they take a particular decision, they are integrating information of different kinds while taking a particular decision. And of course, in these models, interestingly, social attractiveness went out of the window. Social attractiveness was not able to predict the actual decision making to go, but dominance ranks was. So as C became more and more subordinate to her, B was likely to go, because in this group, as females fell in the hierarchy, they were more socially attractive. So clearly, individuals seem to be abstracting information about social attractiveness in terms of rank differences. Right. So basically, the point I want to make here is that an individual, when she's taking a decision, is taking into account a whole range of factors, which means that she must be abstracting and mentally representing some of these personal attributes of herself and those of her social companions. We still do not understand what is the nature of this information that is being stored in the brain, or how these are labeled in terms of categories, but we can discuss that during discussion. So today now we have sort of tried to understand various kinds of cognitive processes in wild macaques, and I've just put a listing here. We've tried to look at social knowledge, which I talked about, how they abstract information and what it tells us about how they conceive of themselves as individuals in that society. We have tried to look at tactical deception and what it tells us about the cognitive ways in which they deceive each other. We have tried to understand multimodal communication and how they refer to external objects and events in different ways. We've tried to understand mechanical intelligence in terms of tool manufacture. And the other very interesting work that we've done is to document a whole range of behavioral traditions or culture in different populations of bonnet macaques. And there have been no systematic studies of culture, but today we know that culture goes beyond the apes. It started off with the monkeys, and there are extremely elaborate behavioral traditions that they seem to be showing. Right. So just to, I will finish in 2 minutes. I wanted to show this slide because I made it to science. This is the only way I could make it, and that's when I got thrown out of Bandipur National Park. The forest department decided that no research would go on in these parks, and so for 2 years we were out. But there were other things I started doing at that same time. And this is Dr. Ullas Karant, a very well-known tiger researcher who was also thrown out of our national parks at that point of time. And okay, I'll forget this. I'll come to it. So what Ullas and I did was we started a postgraduate program in wildlife biology and conservation in NCBS. We physically housed it in NCBS to start off with. Vijay very kindly agreed to it, but later on, of course, it has now been absorbed as an NCBS program, and we have now produced, there are a large number of faculty who teach, a large 15 students who come in every 2 years, and we've worked on different aspects of wildlife biology and conservation across the country. And this is a slide I'm very proud of, because one of the things that we insist on that the master's students do when they complete their dissertation is publish their work. And so this is for the first 3 batches of students. And what you see is that of the 45 dissertations, 43 publications came out and 33 in journals with recognized impact factors. And we are really proud of this, because what we now realize after having done a meta-analysis is that more than 50% of the total wild mammalian literature that exists in India has come from this course. So I think that was quite remarkable, and I think students get to learn how to publish. And I think it's important. And we were talking about publications. I think it's very important to start off fairly early. Right, quickly, sorry. A large number of people who I've worked with, I've purposely not distinguished summer students from faculty, from PhD students, from postdocs. We all worked at it together. And I also put up these pictures here because my students and my postdocs and my colleagues and my friends were as diverse as the subjects we study. And so to end, a number of institutions who have helped us, the Department of Forests and University of Agricultural Sciences, where we have done this work, but who have also thrown us out occasionally, which has led to more innovative ways of studying them. And of course, a large number of organizations who have supported this work. So there is funding out there. We just have to know where to go. There is money. We just have to really work this out. And if you're convinced about the work, you can convince others. I really believe in that. And so finally, so when monkeys are superior to men in this, when a monkey looks into the mirror, he sees a monkey. At the end of this journey, well, close to the end of this journey, I realize who I am. And, and my abstract ended with 3 principles that I follow in my life, and I will tell you honestly that I've learned it from the macaques. No regrets. They don't look back. They don't look back at happiness. They don't look back at sorrow. They move on. No judgments. They live lives on their own. They do not judge what others are doing. They, of course, respond to others, but they do not judge others. And I don't think they have any expectations from each other. Thank you.